Hello, g'day. This is Jack Goff. I'm the current interim CEO of the Invasive Species Council. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this webinar. It's great to have a really special guest with us today from New Zealand, Nicola Toki, who is the CEO of Forest and Bird New Zealand. And I'm also joined by Jody Gunn, who is the CEO of the Australian Land Conservation Alliance in Australia. And so today we're going to have a really interesting discussion, I hope, for you about the issue of invasive species, the work that's going on in New Zealand around their Predator-Free 2050 initiative. And the question that Jody and I in Australia have been exploring with Nicola has been around: what is the moonshot goal for Australia that we should be thinking about, that we should be looking at to really drive ambition from our politicians, from the public, and to bring together a lot of the energy that's already going on with what we know are hundreds of thousands of Australians every year taking action, every day taking action on invasive species and environmental management. So just first up, I wanted to acknowledge that we're in Naarm in Melbourne on the land of the Kulin Nation, and this is an area with the Birrarung River, the Yarra River, that would have been, a very diverse ecosystem: eucalypts going down to the sea, coastal tea tree, and over 1,200 native species, which unfortunately have largely been removed from a very urbanized environment. And if I look out the window, I can see European oaks and I can see large high-rises. And so this is an area that has been changed by invasive species, by the plantings since European arrivals, which means we no longer have that natural Australian environment. So this is something that we're all working on. And Jody, before we get to Nicola, I thought it'd be good just to give an introduction to ALCA, the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, and the work that you guys are up to.
Yeah, thanks, Jack, and great to see you all. The Australian Land Conservation Alliance is a peak body for private land conservation. We represent organisations that protect, manage and restore nature across privately managed land, so really things that aren't in the public parks estate. We've got 19 members, but the sector is much, much bigger than that. Collectively, our members are contributing over $325 million of annual revenue into on-ground land management restoration work, employ over 1,000 people working right across the country, and a huge number of volunteer hours as well. So it's a little bit about us, and we can share some more later.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Jody. And to set the scene before I pass over to our deer hunter next to me, invasive species are often, we're in an age right now of interacting mega threats when it comes to the environment. So we know that we have climate change, accelerating decline, levels of habitat destruction and degradation that mean that many of our plant species are on the brink of extinction. But what a lot of people don't realize is when it comes to animal extinctions in Australia, actually the primary driver of that has been invasive species, and that's principally been predators like cats and foxes and wolf snakes, and pathogens, so things like myrtle rust and chytrid fungus that are driving some of our frogs and some of our plant species extinct. So getting on top of invasive species is essential to being able to manage our landscape and stop extinctions. And I guess one of the things that hits me hard about extinctions is, when I grew up, I thought about extinctions as really about the thylacine in Australia. 100 years ago, that solitary, Tasmanian tiger in a zoo going extinct due to hunting. But extinctions really are a modern phenomenon. They are, I understand, in New Zealand, certainly in Australia, and we've had at least 17 of our animals go extinct since the 1960s. Every single one of them has been driven by invasive species in terms of pushing them over the edge. We know that, unfortunately, the current rate of extinctions in Australia is about 5.5 species per decade, and that is tearing a hole in the fabric of Australian society. So we've brought Nicola along. She's the CEO of Forest and Bird. She's previously been a threatened species ambassador for New Zealand. As I said, she's a deer hunter over there, which, I think speaks to the practical approach to invasive species that's been taken on. And welcome, kia ora, I think is what you say. Yeah, tell us a bit, Nicola, about the Predator Free 2050 initiative.
Sure, and kia ora koroa, kia ora koutou, and thanks for having me. It's been really interesting being here, and funnily enough, I was actually in Hobart yesterday, and I went to the museum and I saw the video of the Thada scene, and I just about cried, you know, thinking about it. And extinctions aren't just something that we record and talk about it in museums. They, as you say, 5.5 a year. New Zealand, I think, has the dubious honour of being exactly on a par with you all, with Australia, in terms of our rates of extinction. So if I talk a little bit about briefly, so I'm the Chief Executive of Forest and Bird. That actually covers all of the ecosystems in New Zealand. It's an NGO, and we have staff and volunteers up and down the country. And put really simply, our job is to give nature a voice, because of course it can't speak for itself. And we do that in a number of ways, and some of that is practical on the groundwork, and some of it is advocacy. If I think about the New Zealand context and the reason that you invited me out here, we have a really unique situation in New Zealand, although I'm seeing lots of similarities with respect to Australia as in how it relates to invasive species. So we've lost 51 species since people and their pests arrived in New Zealand, and most of that has been driven by introduced, more often than not, predators. So in New Zealand, the best way to describe our ecology and our native wildlife in particular, or our fauna, is that we are the land without teeth. And that means if it has 4 legs and fur, it didn't evolve in our country. So, New Zealand kind of broke off from Gondwana 80 million years ago, sailed off into the Pacific with no terrestrial mammals except for a few species of tiny wee bats. And that means that our wildlife has evolved to freeze, to come out at night, to not fly, and to avoid predators from the air, and to find each other when they're living in the bush and nocturnal and needing to find a boyfriend or a girlfriend. They're often really smelly in terms of needing to attract. So put that in the context of modern animals in New Zealand, invasive predators like, we've got so many, stoats, rats. We've got 3 kinds of rats, weasels, ferrets, cats, dogs are even a problem. It's just been a pathway to extinction for some of our most loved species here in New Zealand. And I think I'm seeing you have very different wildlife in Australia, but very similar story of the new things coming in and pushing out and predating on those things that define us as citizens of our 2 countries.
There's mainly birds that have been driven extinct.
Lizards. Yep. We've lost some frogs. We have the most ancient type of frog in the world, and it is kind of everything, and potentially a bat. The jury's still out on one of our 3 species of bat as to whether it still exists or not, but we haven't seen it since the 60s. So and that has all been driven by introduced predators. And I'll give you an example. So we call ourselves Kiwi to the world, and where we don't do pest control in New Zealand, 95% of Kiwi chicks do not survive to 1 year of age. And we don't do pest control in most of New Zealand. So the Department of Conservation does amazing work at suppressing pests on a huge part of our landscape. That's up to over 1 million hectares now, but that's only 20%. And so that means the vast majority of our wildlife is unprotected from the sort of onslaught of bitey things that are making life hell and driving them towards extinction. So given that, the other thing I would say that is similar between our 2 countries and where the real opportunity lies is we define ourselves as citizens of each of our countries by our native wildlife, right? So I've talked about the fact that we're Kiwis on the world stage. I see it here in Australia. Our sports teams are named for our native wildlife. Ours are obviously better, but
not the Rabbitohs and the Brumbies.
Oh, I'm more thinking not the Rabbitohs and the Brumbies. I'm more thinking the Wallabies. which, by the way, are a pest over there. And so are the possums. Sorry, and you're welcome to have them all back. Given that, there's a real opportunity, and it plays out in research. So I found a piece of research about 15 years ago that we're a big company, essentially a big international marketing outfit, was using social science to try and figure out how to sell stuff to people, right? And countries all over the world define themselves as citizens of those nations by factors like freedom of speech, liberty, peace, democracy, clearly things we all take for granted in Australia. And long may that continue. But in New Zealand and Australia, we were complete outliers from 200 other countries because our defining characteristics as citizens of these nations were connection to nature, connection to land. And that's really powerful, really powerful. In New Zealand, when they looked into it, they described it as ethereal, almost soulful, and even further. So they did focus groups with our two weird countries that have this intangible connection at a time where in New Zealand, in the last 2 generations, we've all moved off the farms and into the cities. And yet we hold dear to this idea that nature is what defines us. And so that was the opportunity that led to Predator Free. Because Predator Free is all about protecting who we are and what we stand for and what comprises our identity in New Zealand.
So can you tell us sort of how Predator Free 2050 came about? Because it's from afar, it's a pretty exciting vision.
Yeah. I mean, it is an exciting vision, and it's not without its kind of tricks and faults and hurdles, and we can get to those. It's not an entirely 100% rosy picture, but the point is the vision. And so what was starting to happen back in sort of 2011, 2012, and I previously was working for Forest and Bird as an advocate, and I just managed to bump into enough people who were starting to ask the question, why do we continue to kind of keep trying to suppress things when we're losing so much? Why don't we just get rid of the lot? We're really good in New Zealand at island eradications. In fact, I can all but put money on the fact that if there is an island eradication going on anywhere around the world, it'll be led by a New Zealander and it'll be flown by a New Zealand helicopter pilot. You're welcome from Macquarie.
Good work being done there.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we knew that over time, the area that we were able to eradicate predators from, and the predators in New Zealand that we largely were focusing on, and certainly for Predator Free, rats, possums and stoats. We knew that we could remove predators from islands basically by an area of an order of magnitude every decade or so. So, we started in the 1960s. It was actually Forest and Bird who sponsored a young man to get rats off 1 hectare in an island in the Hauraki Gulf. By 2005, we'd managed to get predators off Campbell Island, which is 11,000 hectares in the subantarctics. We are ready for that next big thing, and that kind of helped build the momentum for Predator Free. But what really did it, so while those conversations were going on, and because I was in this sort of privileged position of being an advocate in Forest and Bird, I pulled 19 experts. We talk about it as the secret meeting. It wasn't really secret. I'm not James Bond, but it was.
It was in a lodge, though.
It was in a lodge. Forest and Bird happens to own land, and we have these sort of lodges across the country. And we have this beautiful lodge in the national park in Ruapehu in the Central North Island, and we kind of got everyone together for 2 days, and they were academic experts on stoat reproduction, for example, or they were, senior practitioners in the Department of Conservation, or they might have been from the farming industry, and we pulled them all together and said, could it be done? Could we get rid of the lot? Is that something that would be possible? And they sort of, there was a bit of clashes of egos, and scientists love to have opinions, and so
advocates don't.
Yeah, I know.
I'm a scientist. I'm allowed to say yes, we do.
I trained in science and law, so I'm like the worst of the worst. It took half a day for this group of people to rough enough agree that with some expected advances in sort of blue sky technology, it was possible on the horizon that it was urgent and that it was necessary. And then it took another day and a half to kind of work, figure out and argue and debate about how we were going to bring the public with us, because that was going to be the thing that really moved it along. And so, lots of things happened over the next year. I was appointed the manager, if you like, of the Predator Free New Zealand Trust. We started all of that. That built the grassroots community movement, because there were already lots of people and communities out there doing trapping. And so this was about joining them all up and making them part of the same vision. And the way that we described it was like Kennedy's shoot for the moon speech. So when John F. Kennedy spoke in 1962 and sort of proposed this idea that the US would be the first country to put a man on the moon, a person on the moon, the US hadn't even got out of orbit. They were flailing around, and some people doing things over there and some people were spending money over there. And that speech galvanized the nation, and everybody focused their attention and the resources and the innovation towards that goal, and they pulled it off within the decade. So, Predator Free New Zealand has often been described as New Zealand's moonshot, and that's kind of where we got to. And in 2016, the National League government at the time announced that New Zealand would be predator free by 2050, and they made it above governments, and they also created a little company designed to bring in funding to fund innovation and technology to find those blue sky advances.
And so above government has meant that all sides of politics have been signed up to it?
Yeah, most. I can't think of a party that is against Predator Free New Zealand, because it is just part of the New Zealand psyche. Because Predator Free, technically, that's an output aim, right? Because we're not really going for predators. It's whose fault it isn't that we're here, and we're really going for thriving wildlife. Kakapo, which is sort of New Zealand's charismatic megafauna, used to be probably in our top 3 most common birds. And by 1991, they were down to 50. And it's taken until now to get to 243. And so the biggest challenge we actually have now in New Zealand is we're running out of room to put some of these species. So, we've really got to crack on with, let's do some bigger areas on the mainland, which brings us into your realm, really, in terms of, as I've been flying around, I've realised Australia's quite big.
And I think that's what I'm really curious about, because one of the challenges that we have in Australia, we have some great success stories about islands as well. From Lord Howe Island, where they've eradicated rats, and
also Kiwis.
Yes, also Kiwis. We just have a little disclaimer at the beginning. A lot of this has been done by the Kiwis. Lord Howe Island. You talked about Macquarie Island.
Yes.
We've got Christmas Island, where the crabs are now coming back. A lot of work being done over there. So many different islands. Kangaroo Island. They've eradicated goats. They're about to target a major cat campaign.
Yeah.
We've got
nearly done pigs.
Nearly done pigs. So, we have a lot of success on islands, and I'm really curious to understand about how do you get to the mainland, because, and we can talk a little bit about the strategies that we have on the mainland, but I'm really keen to understand what are the big challenges or where are the major opportunities that you see for tackling it at that mainland level?
Yeah, and this is where our countries are really different, right? So in New Zealand, it's really common to have a backyard trap, right? There are places in Australia where if you couldn't do that, right? Because you've got lots of native small furry things. And backyard traps aren't going to solve the problem for New Zealand. But what they've done is they have reignited a spark and a sense of care and caring by New Zealanders who might otherwise have gone, well, that's the Department of Conservation's job and that's happening out there and that's not really my business. I live in a small rural community. There are only 200 households. We can't really sit around the table. Yes, I can. We can't really sit around the table and have a conversation about water in my community. We're in a really dry rural community. It would end in tears, but we all kind of club together to do pest control, and we do that on farms. We do that in the village. Also, our pub burned down some years ago, so it brings us together. and
so how has that vision which, you know, as you say, is a moonshot. And I guess part of it with that is may not be possible.
Yeah.
May be possible. That's sort of part of the point of it. How has having that vision, you know, shifted politics or society? What's the actual vision part of it meant to New Zealand?
Well, it has definitely galvanized people, and I can give a couple of examples. So Predator Free 2050 released its biennial report. I think the most recent one was from 2 years ago, so they must be due for another one. And I had 7 clear goals in that. And part of those goals are we've got to maintain suppression of pests while we're trying to figure out these other tools, right? And so the Department of Conservation has been able to expand pest control focused on the goals for predator free within the context of the work they would already be doing, but focus it, you know. Equally, we've had a little company started called Zero Invasive Predators. They've been charged with, or they've taken up the challenge of eradicating predators from 100,000 hectares plus, which is another one of these goals. And they're using the Southern Alps and 2 massive rivers on the west coast of the South Island as the fence. And it's proof of concept stuff. And because it's proof of concept, it's really expensive, but that's okay because we want to see if we can do it. And so it's that galvanizing communities. When COVID happened, the government put a heap of money into Jobs for Nature. And you know, organisations, particularly in my experience, Māori communities all over the country, came together with a view to breathing life back into their natural heritage in their places through pest control and training up their people to do that. And so it's really helped New Zealanders focus on there's something at stake here and we've got to do something about it.
And just before I ask you about shifting baselines, because that's something that you talk about, wanted to say to everyone online, and I can see there's a lot of chat and people commenting. If you do want to put on any questions into that chat, we will have some time at the end to answer some of those questions. And I've got them on this iPad in front of me. So put them in there. I'll be able to see them. So Nick, one of the things that I've heard from you when we've had some meetings with people over the last week has been this idea of baselines shifting and what that can mean for a society. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, thanks. So in ecology, and usually marine ecology, the concept of shifting baselines is a sad story. Right? It generally means, you know, we're born into a time in the world where my father or my grandfather might have had, vast amounts of a particular species of fish, for example. But by the time I'm born, there's hardly any, and that's my normal. That's my baseline. So the baseline shifts in a really bad way.
So the expectations.
Yeah. And I go, well, you know, I saw one fish twice a year. And by the time, you know, my son grows up, his baseline will be less again. So it reinforces loss. What I have seen and been delighted to see in New Zealand is where those communities are working. I have this great little experience with 2 wee girls from Wellington who took me on a walk from their local playground around the outside of the Zealandia predator-proof fence. So we're in Wellington. We're really lucky because there's a predator-proof fence around a catchment reservoir, essentially in the main city of Wellington. And so birds have come back to the city and spilled over that fence that haven't been there for over 100 years, you know. And that is shifting people's expectations of what they want to see around them. And it's different from Australia because, you know, I spent the weekend with my brother here in Melbourne and my nephews and family there, and I just spent the whole time like looking at the sky and watching all the parrots and the parakeets and thinking, this is amazing. We've lost all that in New Zealand already. So shifting baselines for these wee girls, as we walked from the playground down the outside of the fence, sort of a couple of 100 metres, we saw flocks of kaka, our bush parrot, which I've never seen in my lifetime in a city. We saw flocks of wood pigeons. We saw 2 species of bird that have been extinct on the mainland for 100 years, if not for the sanctuary, that were obviously on the other side of the fence. And then we saw nothing because a falcon came down and scared them all and everything went very, very silent. And so that really gives me heart that our new generation of New Zealanders, as they see the work going in, aren't going to accept any degradation of that baseline.
And I think that goes to the absolutely critical role of having audacious goals that people can latch onto and feel connected to, but also the importance of two things I think that you've touched on there, which is storytelling and how important storytelling is. And I guess that goes back to recognising the critical leadership of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Australia, Maori people in New Zealand, in being, the storytellers of their time, and how important stories are. And it also goes back to seeing things in real life so that you've got something to hang on to. A number of the Australian Land Conservation Alliance's members have predator-free enclosures as well. We've got in Australia major cat and fox challenges across, most of Australia. And so huge amounts of effort and resourcing have gone into creating these predator-free safe havens. Now, they can be on islands, but they can also be on the mainlands using fences. And for people to be able to go and see, often they are reintroducing species that are otherwise extinct on the mainland. But so, to be able to take people there and for them to see in real life bettongs, bilbies, moving around them, the awe and the excitement of people to go, wow, this is incredible that these were running around on our mainland and still could one day and are, within these safe enclosures and in landscape scale areas where there's really hard, pet feral animal management. But those are really important, the storytelling and the opportunity for people to see and experience what it was and could be, and to know that there are things being done that can help to achieve that vision.
And I think that's key, and that's probably one of the things. So I love that you talk about storytelling, because I am a big proponent of that. We can science the crap out of something, but unless we can bring people with us with a compelling narrative about how this relates to them, and then further to that, give them a sense of hope. And hope doesn't just mean kind of Pollyannaing it. It means demonstrating, what you've just talked about. When we take action, when your team are in there and you're securing outcomes for invasive species, people can see the impact of that, and it drives further action. And I think at a time in our kind of global history where things seem to be going slightly awry, it's really unifying and good for all of us to be focusing on something that brings us that real kind of joy and sense of self.
Well, one of the things that we've been talking quite a bit from the Invasive Species Council to governments about, and I find quite frustrating, is that with invasive species, that often there is this sense of just doing a little bit forever, not actually investing upfront in getting the job done properly. I've recently been, quite critical of a New South Wales pig management plan, for example. The government put $13 million in, and I think they would love us to be saying, great, you put a whole bunch of money in. But the issue we've seen with that is it's basically money spread across the whole landscape. Every different region gets the same amount of money. They use totally different techniques. They don't get above the population growth rate. And probably are making very limited impact on the actual population of feral pigs that are out there. And so this idea, I guess, of actually putting the resources in to do it well in some places where we can actually demonstrate what is possible, I think is exciting, both in terms of seeing long-term impact on the ground, but also being able to give that hope. And one of the things, Jodie, I was keen maybe for you to talk about, hearing from Nick around that galvanizing of society. We obviously have private land conservation movement, land care movement. How do you see that element of joining up all the good bits of effort that are going, so that we are, for example, I know something we talked about a long while ago was, that catchment-based planning around invasive species, around protected areas, where we join up all that different bits of effort. How are you seeing that starting to happen, particularly with the movement that I think ALCA has started to create by bringing organisations together?
I think it goes to some of the things that you've also touched about, which is finding the connection piece or point for different people who are operating in different ways. So, I guess the proposition ALCA has is that privately managed land occupies, some 60% of Australia. And so we see that as a huge opportunity for people of all kinds who are managing private land. They might be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. They might be farmers. They might be a water catchment. They might be a conservation organisation or an individual landholder who is choosing to effectively manage land for the nature that they're stewarding for future generations. And so no matter what it is that you are managing the land for, you know, the opportunity to bring people together around the idea of stewarding nature, you know, forever and into the long term is the opportunity to that we can see being galvanised. And, you know, it's what we see is whether you're a business, whether you're a farmer, whether you're a conservation organisation, people care.
Yeah.
People care about the lands that they're stewarding. They might have other business activities, but more and more we are seeing recognition and evidence of the role that nature plays in underpinning the productive part of their property or the productive elements of their work. We're seeing businesses realise that they actually have huge dependencies on natural capital and the fundamental services that nature provides. And all of these things bring people together around how they're managing their assets, how they're managing the lands that they might have stewardship responsibility of. I was curious as well, Jack, around this galvanising idea. You know, we talk about you know, predator-free. What would a galvanising vision for Australia around predator-free look like from Invasive Species Council perspective? What's the opportunity there, or the challenges that we'd face in setting an ambition like that?
Yeah, well, look, we're definitely doing some thinking about this, and having Nick come over and sort of, you know, talk to that vision in New Zealand has made me think, and I know our team be thinking a lot, and some of our discussions, even just in the last week with government, have been about this. I think there's a few elements to the sort of differences that are important for this. One of them is obviously the scale of Australia and the diversity of our invasive species. You know, and then that element also of, you know, we do have lots of small mammals, and we do have native predators. You know, in Tasmania, you know, we have Tasmanian devils, we've got dingoes on the mainland, and so that, you know, just being able to have predator-free as the vision is not as simple. But I do think that there's something about place-based visions that we really could tap into. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about is, you know, feral-free. It's a moonshot. And I guess feral tends to talk to animals, but also, you know, or invasive free, obviously weeds are a huge element of that. There are places that we could imagine that at a landscape scale where that sort of vision starts to galvanise the effort of private land conservation, of land care groups, of government agencies, of expectations under biosecurity acts and law.
Yeah.
And so a place like Tasmania is one place that we really, I think that sort of vision, we know that right now in Tasmania, there is not an established fox population. There is not an established goat or pig feral populations, but there is a real chance that they could get started. There's a serious issue around feral deer that have spread from the Midlands and are getting into the Freycinet Peninsula, the Tasman Peninsula, up into the Wilderness World Heritage areas, you know, pigs on Flinders Island, where you could imagine that sort of scale of vision really galvanising investment. Because one of the things, and I know, Jody, you and I have spoken about this before, that we often get frustrated about is investment in conservation often depends on where people are and the population levels. So places like the Northern Territory or Tasmania, which have smaller populations, then get less investment from the federal government. So that sort of vision as well, guiding federal investment into really demonstrating what could be achieved. And I think there are also examples of this that are happening at the moment. I think of the fire ant program, right? Can we eradicate fire ants from southeast Queensland? Probably, but not definitely. Yeah. It is an enormous effort. You know, $1 billion of federal government money has gone into that. You know, just this week we secured new money from the Queensland government for that program. Yeah, but it is driving innovation. Yeah. It is driving ambition. It's driving community engagement. We know, for example, when it comes to fire ants, that nearly all the surveillance that has picked up new fire ant outbreaks has come from communities looking at it. So I think there are really good examples of where that vision that says we're going to eradicate fire ants, for example, or if it was saying, you know, we are going to, get rid of all the deer in South Australia, which is what the South Australian government are looking at right now, where that can galvanise that community effort. I guess one of the things that I'm thinking a bit about, though, and I think it's where ALCA, potentially has a really strong role in this, is often these things are just government-driven visions or just community-driven visions, and how we actually join them up is the thing that
And just listening to you both, that's the thing that I think that's where the real opportunity lies, right? So on the one hand, it's about hearts and minds, of course it is, and that's very much the story that I tell. It's also about dollars and cents. And so, and cents in terms of both spellings, if you like. So, we know that globally, the cost of invasive species to the economy is $400 billion plus a year, and we know that healthy environments are more resilient. They're more resilient to floods. They're more resilient to drought. New Zealand's variably, it's sort of neck and neck with agriculture, but agriculture relies on our biodiversity as well. But our tourism in New Zealand is our highest export, right? Earner. People aren't coming to New Zealand to visit a Westfield Mall, and I was a little bit.
But you've got a great one.
I was a little bit miffed. I would love to have spent more time in Tasmania. That's been on my bucket list for a really long time. And as I said to them last night, no offense, but it wasn't coming here to look at your historic hotels. I want to go out and see the nature, and I will come and spend thousands of bucks to bring my family to come and experience that. So there is a vested interest, and one of the conversations I continue to have with governments, whoever they are of the day, is good economics and good businesses invest in the asset that delivers their income. Right? You invest sustainably, whether it's a rental that you own, or you bought a new apartment block, or you own a shoe shop, whatever. You invest in it in order to ensure a sustainable return. What we see in my country, certainly, is we whittle it down to nothing, cross our fingers and hope for the best, when it's the thing that underpins the prosperity of our entire country. It's madness.
And we see that here. 0.1% of our federal budget goes towards the environment. Groups are calling for, that to raise to 1%. But I think also when you think about goals that drive people, we've got no new extinctions goal. We've got a 30 by 30 target that's been committed. It's a global goal. We've made a commitment to that here in Australia. We've got a nature positive, goal, which is, the parallel to net zero. But it needs all of the things. It needs community to be getting around it. It needs investment, as you say, government, more government investment, state government investment, collective philanthropic organisational commitment, and it needs strong laws. We can't deliver on a no new extinctions target. We can't deliver on invasive species targets. We can't deliver on 30 by 30 if we don't have strong laws for nature that protect the very things that underpin our economy, our well-being and our food security.
So we're going to go into questions in a moment. So I can see lots of people have put questions, but if you've got others, put them in, and I can see cats is coming up quite a lot. But before we get to that, let's go to politics, because we do have a federal election coming up. And so, Nick, maybe just briefly, you've had a change of government recently in New Zealand. What has that meant for the way that approaches to nature have been, and it's obviously to a conservative government? How has that vision sustained itself? And then Jody, I'd be keen to hear, there's been a big announcement over the weekend for significant funding that ALCA's done a lot of campaigning towards. What are ALCA pushing for in the lead up to this federal election? And then we'll go to questions, so get them in.
So in New Zealand, yes, we're halfway through a newish government. Predator Free was a National Party initiative, and National
Party is the Conservative.
Yep. And so and they are the major party in Parliament right now. So I know that they support that concept. And they have two very small coalition partners who seem to be wielding a lot of power. But together they've become what I would describe as it's quite hostile to nature. There's a lot of talk even from our Prime Minister about cutting red and green tape, and which is your whole point, right? If you want a prosperous country that is dependent on thriving nature, you need it. We should be saying, yeah, let's have more red tape. Let's have more things to protect
And
our
as you
native
said, it
wildlife.
goes directly to the identity that we have as Australians.
And it is doomed to failure because it cuts at the heart of who we are. And we have described it quite openly and unapologetically in New Zealand as a war on nature. This government's proposals, which seem to be a daily retraction of environmental protections and laws, is nothing short of a war on nature. And in New Zealand, a war on nature is a war on who we are. And so I don't think that's sustainable for any political party or government, and we won't shut up about it because New Zealanders don't like it. Yeah.
And just before we go to Jody, how does that sort of that broader vision, how is that sustained through that change?
Well, predator free started at the grassroots.
Yep.
And that's where the power lies, right? So the momentum comes from communities. It comes from local iwi or Māori communities up and down the coast. It comes from businesses who really believe that this is the thing. And it particularly comes to local communities wanting to do something good in their neighbourhoods. And the power of the people is always greater than the people in power.
Excellent. We hope. So Jody, yeah, we've got this federal election coming up. You had that big announcement.
Yep.
How did you respond to that announcement, and also what is ALCA pushing for parties in?
Yeah. So the announcement over the weekend was a $250 million package towards the 30 by 30 target, so protecting 30% of Australia by 2030. We've got to work through what the detail of that looks like, and it's over a number of years. So we very much welcomed this because it's really a first financial commitment by the government to actually help to get us there, that particularly would be targeting the opportunity for private land conservation. Really importantly, we've seen investment and continue to see investment in Indigenous protected areas. They're a really critical pathway to achieving 30 by 30. We've had a number of declarations over a few years, and we anticipate we will see more. The role of private land conservation, I think one of the opportunities for achieving 30 by 30 is it's not just a scale target, and this goes to some of the detail. You've got to be able to ensure that it will also deliver on, no new extinctions. And that means targeting key areas that are high biodiversity areas. The strategies for doing that are quite different to the strategies in terms of getting to scale. We also know that we need to ensure that Australia is so diverse. We have such a big diversity of ecosystems. We need to make sure that that diversity is protected as well. So those funds need to now be strategic. They need to be targeted, and they need to be leveraged by non-government organisations who are ready to get on with the work, Indigenous partners, and philanthropy and state governments. Absolutely. So it's welcome news, and now we need to use that and scale and build that over time. So that's a key part of what we're hoping for. We haven't seen any other environmental commitments yet from other parties. We're looking to do that. I mean, investing in our environment has not been, one party or another. We have seen investments from both sides over years. And so we're waiting to see and are looking forward to seeing what other parties will bring forward as we move into the election in terms of their environmental commitments. Ultimately, a big call is going to be, really two big things. We need to see the EPBC law reforms go ahead in their full.
So that's the national
environmental laws. They must be delivered in full. They didn't get through this term. We have to see commitments from both sides to implementing those. Otherwise, financial investments around the edges isn't going to get us to where we need to be as a country. We also need to see a scale up in funding overall. This is a welcome start, the $250 million. That's some key strategic initiatives. We need to see that build. And as I said, there's a number of organisations who are really looking to see that lift up to 1% of our federal budget.
Yeah, excellent. And look, in terms of the Invasive Species Council for this election, for us, it is largely about the baseline level of funding for nature is so woeful that we are seeing many of our protected areas trashed, trampled, polluted, choked to death by invasive species. And so we've been talking to parties about some, big vision, and one of them's been about a national island eradication initiative. So this is really building off, similar to the predator-free concept in New Zealand, but this idea that we have demonstrated in Australia that island eradications can be one of the most effective conservation interventions that we can make. But at the moment, the funding is small. It tends to be quite ad hoc. You know, we get bits of funding has to come from the National Heritage Trust or the state government, or, you know, philanthropy is putting significant money, or groups like Nature Foundation and Bush Heritage and AWC investing in these processes. So they often ad hoc, and that is actually limiting the scale of ambition. So one of the things we're pushing for is a National Island Eradication Fund. Another thing we're pushing for, we just had $24 million from the federal government, from the Queensland government to scale up some of the fire ant eradication. We need matched funding from the federal government on that. And a third thing in our sort of broader policy campaign has been about federal investment in stopping the decline of our World Heritage and other existing protected areas, because these cannot be set and forget areas. So it's going to be a big election, but I'm going to come to the questions. And the one that seems to have come up quite a lot here, there's two things that have come up all over the place, which probably don't surprise any of us. One is cats, how New Zealand's managing cats, and the second is the social license around 1080.
Oh, yeah.
So do you want to talk to cats and how New Zealand's dealing with that? Because it wasn't one of the three that you mentioned in Predator Free 2050.
Yeah, it wasn't one of the three. We didn't have social license really. There wasn't really a political appetite or a social appetite to ask the question about cats at the time. I think New Zealand has moved on a lot since then in terms of understanding the impact that cats are having out there in the nature. To be quite honest, I think Australia is gripping up the problem of cats better than New Zealand is, in terms of, we are now at a point where, for example, Forest and Bird works with the likes of the SPCA and Predator Free and other organisations on advocating for a cat management sort of act, some cat management legislation. We're not there yet, and part of my deal with coming over here, having been invited by Jack and the Invasive Species Council team, was, okay, great, I want to talk to you about cats and I want to talk to you about deer. So, I would say our appetite has changed, and socially we have definitely moved on as a country from where we were 10 years ago, but we haven't coalesced that in a really impactful way yet. But I think we're not far off, so we might copy your homework a little bit. I was actually going to say to you, in terms of, you're trying to find a collective vision that will motivate everyone, just say that you want to one up New Zealand.
That'll work. It's worked before, hasn't it?
Give it a rugby nickname.
Fair enough. But obviously, in terms of cats, that's a large part of what some of these
absolutely
predator-free sanctuaries.
A huge amount of effort going into cat eradication. I think it's really important to note cat eradication, is best done in an integrated pest animal management, approach. You take out cats, you have other things, move up. So certainly taking an integrated approach to feral animal management is really important. But cats are a huge problem for Australia's native species. They've not adapted with cats, so they're not adapted to be able to respond to the threat that they pose. There's a range of key strategies. Fenced enclosures that actually removes cats completely from population is having significant impacts on recovering threatened species populations. We have seen some of these islands, and when I say islands or sanctuaries, they're not necessarily literally islands in water. Sometimes they can be islands around fences. Wilson's Pond, for example, is a point at the end of the southern end of Victoria that they can create some fenced enclosures that means that part of the mainland can be excluded. We can exclude foxes and cats from those areas. Phillip Island, Kangaroo Island, and as mentioned, a number of our organisations, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, Odinata, Bush Heritage, take different approaches. But you've also seen some really targeted landscape scale approaches to dealing with that outside of fenced enclosures. Now, it takes a huge amount of human effort, time effort, but also really important innovations in terms of technology. So, from particular, targeted, traps. You've got your Felixer trap, which is using AI technology to understand and detect what a cat looks like as opposed to a quoll or other native species, and a range of other, targeted approaches to dealing with that outside of fenced enclosures, knowing that, we can't obviously fence off the whole of Australia, so we need to be working at both levels, trying to get them out of, get the populations down low enough that native species can start to thrive.
And one of the things, obviously, that good invasive species management is about is using nature, and one of the things that we've seen impressive where there is funds available has been responses to post bushfire or during drought situations, being able to really crash the populations of invasive species, and cats are extremely good at adapting their birth rate to natural conditions. And if you can get that population down when it is drought or conditions, then you can mean that you start with a much lower baseline. That's something that unfortunately in Australia during the last drought we really didn't have that investment. And I guess part of increasing the funding available to these things and the community enthusiasm is actually setting ourselves up for those moments. The Kangaroo Island pig eradication was because some people on that island went, hang on, we just had those catastrophic fires. Let's get in and deal with the pigs right now, or we will miss the window of opportunity. So, so social license, I guess, is something that we focus on a lot, whether it's social license around the fire ant baiting program, around being able to manage cats effectively, and ensuring that people keep their pet cats indoors and that they're not out killing our wildlife. 1080 is coming up a lot here in the questions, both. There seems to be some spirited discussions about whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. Obviously, 1080 does have some pretty significant animal welfare impacts when it's used. How's that been navigated in New Zealand as an effective tool, but with these
I mean, I have ended up being an advocate for 1080 for 20 years. Depending on what role I've held, whether that was working for agriculture, working for the public service, working for not-for-profits, or even the private sector. So I know a thing or two about it. And in New Zealand, with no native mammals, if you sit down with people and say, what if we designed a toxin that was derived from a natural ingredient that targeted mammals and didn't have such a big impact on our native wildlife, would you like that? And then everyone goes, yeah, we'd love that. We'd love that. And we go, well, that's 1080, right? So, and it dissolves in water, and breaks down in water and breaks down in soil over time, etc. Right? So New Zealand. Have often been challenged about the fact we use so much of it in New Zealand. That's because we don't have any small furry mammals, right? And it certainly is a problem for mammals. It is applied and managed really rigorously in New Zealand. I used to be responsible for 1080 operations in some of our national parks to protect some of our most endangered wildlife, like species of parakeets down to just 150 individuals in the wild, that kind of thing. It definitely knocks over. There are by-kill impacts of 1080, but I will give you an example. So Kia, if you've been to New Zealand, you will be familiar. If you've been to a New Zealand ski field, you may be familiar with Kia. They tend to like to rip your windshield wipers off on the ski fields. They're an alpine parrot, really intelligent, amazing animals. In areas where we don't do pest control, we lose, I think, 95% of chicks in a mast year. So that's when the forests kind of all fire out their seed in one go, which drives mice, which drives rats, which drives stoats, and it is a very bad vicious cycle. So we definitely unintentionally kill Kia when we run 1080 operations, but the recruitment level goes up by something like 60%. So we are turning the dial on species that have just not been able to evolve with mammals almost instantaneously by being able to apply 1080 as a treatment to be able to give that wildlife a chance to breed essentially and recover briefly before we do it again. It's not the ideal solution, but it is better than what would have occurred, which would have been dozens more extinctions of some of our most precious wildlife.
And I guess one of the things we often talk about with communities, in the media, with politicians, is that killing animals is not nice. It's not something that any of us want to happen, but it is about taking responsibility for the impact that, when Europeans came to Australia or to New Zealand, there has been an absolute devastating impact directly on our native wildlife by the introduction of predators, of browsers like deer and pigs, and of some of our weeds, and we need to take responsibility for that.
Yeah.
And I guess the sad reality when it comes to feral animals is that often involves having to kill those animals. That's something that we do need to acknowledge is difficult. We do need to make sure is not indiscriminate, that if we are going to undertake some of these programs, that they are targeted, they have clear objectives, that there's monitoring involved, that we don't just half do the job. I mean, one of the things that we've seen with a lot of programs of feral animal control is if you just half do the job, you end up killing a lot more animals.
Oh, yeah.
And getting it done right up front, you know.
And I think the evidence speaks for itself. And this is where I'm going to be a big champion for monitoring, because governments love to cut monitoring when they're kind of going through the budgets, right? So the monitoring in New Zealand post 1080 operations, like we have this tiny little bird called a rock wren, which weighs about as much as a postcard. And we think we don't even know what happens to it in winter. It's the only bird in the country that lives above the snow line. And in winter, we think it might tuck down into the rocks and basically, hibernate. We were losing all of our populations of rock wren everywhere where there was no pest control. Where we've used 1080, those rock wren populations have doubled. So it's a very simple recipe. So we either have none or we can return them. And you're right, we have a responsibility as New Zealand citizens, as Australian citizens, and globally, because these creatures aren't found anywhere else in the world.
And I'm loving the comment here from Leo saying that with these things, we need nuanced arguments. That they can't just be black and white, that there are times that you will see the Invasive Species Council actively opposed to invasive species control programs because they're not effective, they're wasting money, and often they're killing animals indiscriminately. There are good times, there are a multitude of different tools and techniques, and we need that nuanced discussion.
And we need to keep investing in innovation. We need to keep finding new solutions that are going to do better than the last one, so that we can address the challenges that exist with current solutions.
So there's a couple of questions here, Jodie, about where does the money come from? And that seems to be both from the perspective of, we didn't plant these weeds, we didn't introduce these animals, why do I need to why do I have to be forced to control them? But also, should we be taxing mining companies what do we need to do to get this money?
Show me the money.
Yeah, sure. But I guess, Alka, you've been thinking about the sort of the diversity of funding sources that need to come together to make this work. Where are you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an opportunity for a range of different funding sources. We've been doing a lot of work thinking for many years, thinking about, innovative finance for nature. And I think Invasive Species Council operates in that cross sector of multiple government responsibilities. Invasive species in the context of farming landscapes, might be different in the context of conservation landscapes, but ultimately we're often targeting the same species. So really looking across whole of government reform. I think one of the things, I sit on the Nature Finance Council, which is a federal government appointed council that's looking at beyond the Environment Department and what are the whole of government reform opportunities that can not only, untap government responsibility, but also unlock private sector finance. We have a range of different frameworks that are on development globally and here in Australia that think about things like natural capital and what that looks like and means for a landholder or an asset manager. We've got frameworks that are starting to drive businesses and companies to think about what are their dependencies and risks as they relate to nature. And once those dependencies or risks are understood, they can start thinking about how they mitigate their risks or how they invest in the opportunities. And there's a whole lot of broader government. So, nature isn't just an environment issue. It's a climate department and division issue. It's an agricultural issue. It's a food security issue. It's a mining industry issue. It's a health issue. So it should be considered as a whole of government issue, and therefore funding should be coming from all of those places.
Excellent. Well, we're coming up to time, and I just wanted to leave everyone online with a couple of things that you can do. The first one is to say that Australian Land Conservation Alliance, Forest and Bird, Invasive Species Council, we are all donor-run organisations. Keen for you all to jump online, check out our websites, but also think about how you can support us to continue to be these advocates and voices for nature, for action on invasives, for action on private land conservation. And the other one, just before I say thank you, was just the Invasive Species Council. We have put out a very comprehensive policy document around the federal election and options for candidates. And one of the things that we've done on our website, if you go to it and you look at the number one take action topic there, item on that website, on the Invasive Species Council website, is we've made it really easy for you to be able to send a message to all the candidates in your local electorate ahead of the election. You can get on there, put in your address, it'll give you the email addresses of those candidates. You can send a personalized message. And what we're asking you to do is to send two simple messages. One, you care about the environment, you're worried about the impact of invasive species, habitat destruction, and you want governments to invest in that. And two, specifically right now, that we need them to double that funding with an extra $24 million for fire ant eradication. That's a specific one. And then the broader message. If people can do that, that would be fantastic. Huge thank you, Jody, for coming and joining us. And massive thanks, Nick, for coming over from New Zealand, for sharing that vision and for, I think, inspiring a lot of us. And I've been in a lot of meetings with Nick. It has definitely inspired people in Australia. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Cheers.
Thanks, Jody.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.